The first time Calvin Mercer understood that the bobcat was not trying to come inside, the porch light had already turned the snowflakes gold. They fell slowly through the dark above Bitterroot Creek, soft as ash, catching on the split-rail fence and the low shoulders of the woodpile. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke, black coffee, and the wool socks drying too close to the stove. Somewhere beyond the porch, the pines knocked together in the mountain wind with that hollow winter sound that made an old house feel older. Calvin had gone to latch the door for the night when he saw her. At first, she was only a shape beside the bottom step, tucked close to the cabin wall where the wind could not reach as sharply. She lay with her paws folded beneath her chest, her spotted coat blurred by the blue shadows, her ears high and pointed. One ear carried a small torn notch near the tip. Her left side rose and fell in shallow, careful breaths. Calvin froze with one hand still on the doorframe. A bobcat did not sleep beside a man's cabin unless something in the world had gone wrong. A healthy one would have vanished at the scrape of his boot, melted into the furs without leaving him more than a flash of tail and a question. But this one only opened her pale amber eyes, looked straight at him, and gave a slow blink that seemed less like trust than exhaustion. She did not ask to be saved. She did not move toward the warmth. She only lowered her chin again, as if the broken wooden step, half buried in snow, had become the one place in the valley where she could rest without surrendering herself. Calvin had learned, over 64 winters, that some loneliness had claws and some had silence. He had lived with the second kind for nearly 3 years, ever since his wife, Miriam, had gone from the cabin one clear October morning in an ambulance that drove down the mountain road too slowly and never brought her back. Since then, he had kept his days tidy. He rose before sunrise, split kindling by the shed, boiled coffee in the dented blue enamel pot Miriam had loved, and repaired small things that did not truly need repairing. A loose hinge, a crooked shelf, the gate latch that stuck in damp weather. He fixed what he could reach. The things he could not fix stayed with him. The bobcat's whiskers twitched when a flake landed on her nose. She turned her head away with such offended dignity that despite the cold ache in his chest, Calvin almost smiled. The look she gave the snow was the look Miriam used to give the old toaster when it burned only one side of the bread. "Well," he whispered, though he knew better than to speak too much around a wild creature, "you picked a poor night to nap outside." The bobcat's ears angled toward his voice, then away again. She had heard him. She had also decided he was not important enough to answer. That, too, felt familiar. Calvin eased the door open just enough to step back inside. The warm room behind him seemed suddenly too bright, too full of human smells. A plaid blanket was folded over the chair by the stove. A pair of reading glasses rested on the windowsill. One of his work gloves had fallen near the boot tray, fingers curled upward like it was asking a question. He moved slowly, because wild fear punished haste. From the pantry shelf, he took a tin of sardines he had bought months earlier and never opened. Miriam had hated the smell, and after she was gone, Calvin had somehow continued not opening them, as if an old dislike could remain in the house like a rule. He stood there with the little tin in his hand, feeling foolish and strangely nervous, a man negotiating with an animal that had not agreed to negotiate. He did not know then how many evenings would come to turn around that porch. He only knew the night was cold. For anyone listening close to this quiet beginning, the story asked very little, only that if it touched some tender place, they might like and subscribe softly, and leave a note about where they were watching from, and the name of an animal that had once changed the shape of their heart. Calvin opened the tin near the sink, winced at the smell, and muttered an apology to the empty kitchen. The old wall clock ticked above him. Outside, the porch boards gave a tiny creak, and he looked up so quickly he nearly dropped the fork. Through the window, the bobcat was standing now. Not running, not approaching, standing. Her back legs seemed steady enough, but she favored the left front paw, lifting it from the snow and setting it down again with care. She sniffed the air once, wide nose working, then turned her head toward the black line of trees. Her body knew the wild. Every lean muscle in her seemed pointed toward escape. Yet, after a moment, she folded herself back beside the step, facing the forest rather than the door. That was what caught him most. She wanted the open dark. She wanted the trees, the creek bed, the rabbit trails under the brush, the freedom that had shaped every inch of her. But she also wanted this narrow strip of shelter beneath a leaking porch roof, beside a cabin owned by a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen by anything. Calvin carried the sardines outside in a shallow chipped saucer. The cold bit instantly through his shirt sleeves. He did not go close. He set the saucer on the porch floor near the top step, then thought better of it, picked it up again, and placed it farther away, near the edge where she could reach it without feeling trapped. 3 feet from the door, far enough to be respectful, near enough to be kind. The bobcat watched every movement. Her pupils widened until the amber nearly vanished. When his knee cracked as he straightened, she flinched so sharply that Calvin lifted both hands without thinking. "All right," he murmured. "I heard that too." The corner of his mouth moved again, not quite a smile, but close. He backed into the cabin and left the door open a hand's width. Cold air slid across the floorboards. The stove popped. The smell of fish crept in like an unwelcome guest. Somewhere in the kitchen, an old mousetrap snapped at nothing, and Calvin shook his head, because even the cabin seemed to be overreacting. For several minutes, the bobcat did nothing. Then, with the grave caution of a creature accepting no favors lightly, she rose and limped toward the saucer. She did not lower her head at once. She circled it once, sniffed the rim, flicked her short tail, and glanced at the trees as if checking whether the forest had seen her accepting help. Only then did she eat. Calvin watched from behind the curtain, though he pretended he was only checking the weather. A bit of snow slid from the porch roof and landed beside her with a soft thump. The bobcat sprang back, offended again, then returned to the fish after deciding the roof was not alive. That was the first warmth of it. Not love, not trust, just a tired wild cat, a stubborn old man, and a broken porch step holding its place between them. When the saucer was clean, she did not come to the door. She did not rub against anything or look grateful in any human way. She simply turned once in the snow, pressed her body back against the cabin wall, and tucked her paws beneath her chest again. Calvin stayed at the window long after his coffee had cooled. He had spent 3 years learning how a house sounded when no one needed him in it. That night, beneath the porch light, a bobcat with a torn ear slept by his steps and gave him no promise at all. Still, before he went to bed, he left the porch light on. By morning, the snow had stopped, and Bitterroot Creek moved under ice with a low, secret sound. Calvin woke before the stove had gone out. He had slept badly, waking twice to listen for claws on the porch boards, and once to the sharp cry of a fox beyond the woodlot. At 4:30, he sat on the edge of the bed and waited for his knees to remember him. The room held the blue-gray chill just before dawn. Miriam's quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, though he had not unfolded it since the winter after she died. He dressed in the dark, because habit still knew where everything was. Wool shirt on the chair, suspenders over the bedpost, heavy socks tucked into his boots, because the cabin floor had never forgiven mourning. In the kitchen, he lit the stove and filled the old blue enamel pot. The handle had been replaced twice with wire and stubbornness, and one side was stained by years of flame. Miriam had said it made the coffee taste like patience. Calvin had never known whether she meant that kindly, but he kept using it anyway. The first warmth of his mornings was small and foolish. He poured coffee into Miriam's chipped yellow mug first, let it sit across from him for one breath, then moved it back to the shelf before it could become too sad. Some mornings he pretended the mug was only warming. Some mornings he pretended nothing at all. Outside, the porch light still burned. That was new. He opened the curtain with 2 fingers. The bobcat was gone. For a moment, he felt something drop inside him, though he told himself it was only relief. The saucer he had left near the step sat turned upside down in the snow, as if the visitor had objected to its usefulness. A narrow trail of prints led from the porch to the side of the cabin, crossed beneath the kitchen window, then vanished around the woodpile. Each print was round and neat, without the claw marks a dog would leave. She had walked lightly, even when tired. Calvin stood there longer than necessary. The coffee began to spit on the stove. He had not always lived so carefully. Before Miriam's lungs grew weak in the cold months, the cabin had carried noise easily. Her radio had played old fiddle tunes on Saturdays, while she rolled biscuit dough with too much flour. Their son, Peter, had once run through the mudroom as a boy, with trout in a bucket and news too urgent to wait. Neighbors had stopped by without calling, because on Bitterroot Ridge, people still believed a porch light meant coffee and not a warning. Then Peter had moved to Spokane for work. Miriam's chair had gone empty. The radio had gone silent, because Calvin could not bear the cheerful fiddle without her tapping 1 foot under the table. Even old Button, the cabin cat, had passed in the warmest patch of sun near the pantry door, leaving Calvin with one less creature to scold. After that, the house learned quiet. Calvin helped it along. He stacked firewood by height. He wiped the table after every meal, even if the meal was only toast. He kept a notebook beside the door where he wrote down weather, creek level, and repairs needed. When the wind rattled the loose pane in the sitting room, he wedged a folded seed catalog beneath the frame and called it fixed. He worked 3 mornings a week at the little ranger supply shed near Larkspur Crossing, sharpening tools, sorting trail signs, and pretending that being needed for wrenches and screws was enough. Ranger Elise Navarro often left him broken lanterns to mend. She never said she knew he liked being asked. She only kept asking. Small warmth had survived in scraps around town. Mrs. Hennessy saved bruised peaches for him. The bakery girl slipped him bread for chickens he no longer kept, and a bold gray jay waited on his fence rail each Thursday with the entitlement of a tax collector. But none of it changed the shape of his evenings. Evenings were where the emptiness lived. At dusk, the mountain turned violet, and smoke settled low among the pines. Calvin would split kindling until his hands ached, then carry it inside in 3 exact armloads. He would set 1 plate at the table, 1 fork, 1 folded napkin he rarely needed. He would eat slowly, because there was no reason to hurry, and no one to tell about the deer that crossed the road, or the cloud that looked like Miriam's Sunday hat. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. Deer came and went. Elk passed like weather. Coyotes sang from different hills each night. Even grief moved around, sometimes lying at his feet, sometimes standing at the far edge of the room, where he could almost ignore it. That was why the bobcat troubled him. Not because she was dangerous, though he respected the sharpness hidden in her small, muscular body. Not because she had eaten from his saucer and might return. She troubled him because she had chosen the place just beside his door, close enough to be seen, far enough to refuse comfort. Calvin understood that arrangement too well. After breakfast, he carried the saucer inside with a broom handle, though there was nobody watching to mock him for being cautious. The porcelain had a faint fish smell and 1 small tooth mark on its rim. He tilted it toward the light and found himself murmuring, "Well, you didn't like the dish, but you cleaned it." The porch answered with a drip from the eaves. At the bottom step, the broken board had collected a soft crescent of fur. Tawny, black-tipped, caught on a splinter. Calvin did not touch it. He crouched there, in the cold, with his breath clouding before him, and felt the strange care of not disturbing something that had already left. Beyond the woodpile, a chickadee scolded him, as if he were late. He rose slowly and went to split kindling. The axe bit into cedar, releasing a bright, sweet smell that filled the morning air. With each swing, he looked once toward the spruce line, then told himself not to. By noon, he had looked 27 times. The cabin, empty so long that emptiness felt like furniture, had gained a question. And Calvin, who had spent years answering only to clocks, weather, and memory, found himself listening for the return of silent pause. It happened 2 mornings later, when the sky had cleared to a hard winter blue, and the snow over Bitterroot Ridge shone bright enough to make Calvin squint. Every step beyond the cabin gave a dry crunch. The creek spoke under its lid of ice. Calvin had gone to the woodpile with the old canvas carrier under one arm. He had not seen the bobcat again, though he had found signs of her while pretending not to search. A print beside the pump, a tuft of fur on the lower fence rail, the clean absence of lice near the feed bin. He was reaching for a split log when the jay on the fence rail exploded into scolding. Calvin turned. Beneath the low blue spruce near the wash line, something tawny pulled itself deeper into shadow. He did not move. The spruce branches hung heavy with snow, their tips nearly touching the ground, making a green cave between trunk and frozen earth. Inside it, 2 pale amber eyes watched him. Then he saw the torn notch in one ear, and the short black-tipped tail pressed tight against her side. The bobcat had been there all along. Not on the porch, not asking anything of him, but close enough to know the house, hear the stove door open, and study his mornings from a place she could defend. Calvin's fingers tightened around the carrier. "Well," he said softly, and stopped there. Her ears flattened. Her body did not rise. That told him more than a hiss would have. A healthy bobcat would have vanished under those spruce limbs like smoke. This one crouched with her left front paw tucked close, shoulders stiff, whiskers pushed forward in warning. She was not tame. She was only deciding whether the old man with the wood carrier was worth the pain of running. The smell of cold sap drifted from the cut logs. Calvin remembered Miriam slipping on that same path one winter and laughing while he fussed over her. Now nobody laughed from the kitchen window. Only the bobcat watched him, narrow-eyed and furious with need. Calvin lowered the canvas carrier to the snow. The jay hopped along the fence rail and puffed itself up, offended that neither of them had consulted it. That was the first small mercy of the morning. Calvin whispered, "You keep out of this, Mr. Mayor." The jay shrieked, as if elected to do exactly the opposite. The bobcat's eyes flicked toward the bird. Her tail tip twitched once, sharp and involuntary. Even tired, even hurt, she still noticed movement, still counted chances, still belonged to the old rules of hunger and snow. Calvin respected that. He took one backward step, then another. The bobcat's body eased by a fraction, though her chin stayed low. Sunlight slipped through the spruce and lit the pale fur along her muzzle. She was young, not a kitten, not fully old either. Burrs clung near her shoulder. Her left paw had swollen enough to make the toes spread differently in the snow. He did not like seeing that. He liked less the thought that followed. If she had chosen the cabin, she must have run out of better choices. Calvin went back inside without the wood. The kitchen smelled of bitter coffee and stove smoke. He stood with his cap still on, looking at the pantry shelf. Sardines again would be too much, Elise would probably say. He could hear the ranger's calm voice telling him not to turn a wild animal into a porch beggar. He took a small piece of plain cooked chicken from yesterday's soup and cut it smaller with Miriam's paring knife. He set the chicken on an old jar lid, because the bobcat had already declared her opinion about saucers. Then he laughed under his breath, choosing the lid with the least rust, as if she might appreciate presentation. When he stepped outside again, he did not approach the spruce. He placed the jar lid halfway between the porch and the tree, then retreated to the chopping block and sat facing slightly away. A drop of melted snow slid from the eaves and found the back of his neck with cruel accuracy. Calvin jerked and muttered a word he would not have used in church. From beneath the spruce came the faintest sound, not a purr, but a chuff through the bobcat's nose. Perhaps warning, perhaps the wild world making its own dry comment. Calvin looked down quickly so she would not feel watched, but the corner of his mouth betrayed him. Minutes passed. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a straight gray thread. The chicken cooled on the jar lid. At last, the spruce branches trembled. The bobcat emerged one paw at a time, low to the ground, her spotted coat breaking into pieces against light and shadow. She did not look at the food first. She looked at Calvin, then the cabin, then the trees. Her world was a map of exits. She limped to the lid, sniffed it, and took one piece of chicken. Instead of eating there, she backed under the spruce, with it held carefully in her teeth. Calvin nodded once, as though she had made a fair business decision. She returned twice more. On the third trip, she paused near the lid and lifted her injured paw clear of the snow, holding it against her chest while she stared at him with open suspicion. A burr hung from one whisker, making her look lopsided and grand at the same time. The third warmth arrived before he could stop it. "You've got a little decoration," he whispered. She blinked once, slow and unimpressed, then retreated with the last piece. Calvin sat there until his fingers went numb. He did not try to move closer. He did not call her anything yet. A name felt like a claim, and she had given him no right to claim even a shadow. Still, when he finally stood, the bobcat did not disappear. She remained beneath the spruce, watching him carry wood inside in 2 awkward armloads. Each time he passed, she followed him with those pale eyes, proud, frightened, and unbearably tired. By dusk, the jar lid was empty. By dark, the porch step remained bare. But under the spruce, where the snow had hollowed around her body, Calvin saw the faint shape of a resting place. Not home, not trust, not yet. Only a first agreement, written in distance, hunger, and the careful mercy of not coming too close. Calvin waited until the road to Larkspur Crossing had thawed enough to show 2 brown ruts through the snow, before he told Ranger Elise Navarro about the bobcat. He had meant to mention it casually, the way a man might mention a loose bridge plank. But the moment he stepped into the ranger shed, with its smell of wet canvas, motor oil, and pine shavings, Elise looked over the rim of her mug and said, "You've got that face." Calvin hung his cap on a nail. "I have one face." "No," she said. "You have the face you wear when you broke something and the face you wear when something living found you." That was the first warmth of the morning. Elise had been 39 then, lean and practical, with dark hair always escaping its braid. He told her carefully. A young bobcat, torn ear, hurt left paw, sleeping by the porch, eating small amounts, keeping distance. Elise set down her mug and listened like the mountains had taught her to listen. "You did right not touching her," she said. "I wasn't planning on cuddling her. I know." A corner of Elise's mouth lifted, but people get sentimental when fur is involved. Calvin looked out the small window toward the ridge. "She's not sentimental." "No," Elise said. "She's wild. That's the part you have to protect most." The word stayed with him on the drive home. Kindness had to leave room for wildness. Elise had said it twice before he left. Once while giving him the number of a wildlife rehabilitator in Missoula, and once while handing him proper scraps from the shed freezer. At the cabin, the afternoon had turned silver. Clouds pressed low against the ridge. and the snow smelled damp, ready to become mud. Beneath the blue spruce, the bobcat watched him return. She had changed places while he was gone. Not far, just enough to make a point. She sat behind the woodpile now, half hidden between stacked cedar and the old sled Miriam used to drag kindling. Her torn ear twitched whenever the truck engine ticked. Calvin lifted one hand, then felt foolish and lowered it. The bobcat responded by looking away. "That seems fair," he murmured. He began the new routine that evening. 3 feet from the door, no closer, sometimes farther, if she seemed tense. He used an old flat baking tin, because it did not tip in the snow, and because she had knocked the jar lid under the porch where he could not reach it without lying on his stomach, like a man begging forgiveness from raccoons. He placed the food, stepped back, and went inside. The first night she waited until dark. Calvin saw her only as a shadow crossing the porch boards, low and quick. She took one piece, carried it to the edge of the steps, and ate facing the trees. Then she returned for another. She never turned her back fully to the cabin. The second night, she came while the stove still glowed through the window. She sniffed the tin with deep suspicion, then hooked one paw over the edge and dragged it 2 inches away from the door before eating. Calvin watched from the kitchen and nodded, negotiated. On the third night, she dragged the tin to the broken step, ate beside it, and left one small piece untouched, as if paying rent badly. The warmth of those days gathered in tiny accidents. The bobcat disliked the blue tin, but tolerated the dented one, which made Calvin wonder if she shared Miriam's opinion about color. A squirrel dropped pine cone scales onto her back from the spruce, and she rose with such slow, insulted majesty that Calvin had to turn away before she caught him smiling. Once, she batted at the loose porch broom straw through the railing, only once, then sat sternly as if the broom had started it. Yet for every tenderness, there was a boundary. When Calvin opened the door too quickly, she vanished. When he coughed too loudly, she flattened into shadow. When his boot slipped on ice and he grabbed the rail with a sharp crack of wood, she bounded halfway to the trees, despite the bad paw, then stopped and looked back with bright, hard eyes. That look taught him more than Elise had. The bobcat did not owe him calm. She had survived whatever had left her thin and limping. She had chosen his porch not because it was home, but because it was useful. A roof edge broke the snow. A wall held heat after sunset. An old man moved slowly enough to be studied. Calvin repeated it to himself like a promise. Useful was enough. Still, the house changed. He began stepping over the creaky board just inside the door. He stopped letting the screen slam. He carried firewood before dusk so he would not startle her later. At night, when the wind moved down the creek and found every crack in the cabin wall, he sat by the stove with his coffee cooling and listened for the scrape of the baking tin. Sometimes she came, sometimes she did not. On the night she stayed away, he told himself that was good. A wild thing should have business elsewhere. A bobcat should walk ridgelines, scent mark fallen logs, vanish into brush, and leave men guessing. But when the porch remained empty too long, Calvin would rise and check the window anyway. One evening near the end of the week, snow began again, lighter than before. Calvin set the dented tin 3 feet from the door and retreated. The bobcat appeared from beneath the spruce almost at once. She limped less, not healed, but better. She paused at the foot of the steps and looked through the narrow gap in the curtain where Calvin stood badly hidden. Then she lowered herself beside the broken step instead of carrying the food away. For the first time, she ate there. Afterward, she did not leave. She washed one paw with quick, efficient strokes, passed it over her torn ear, and tucked herself against the cabin wall. Her eyes stayed open. Her body stayed ready. But she rested. Calvin stood in the dim kitchen with one hand on the curtain and felt the ache shift, not disappear, just make space for something quieter. A wild bobcat was teaching him that sometimes care was a door left closed, a light left on, and a meal placed 3 feet away. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, Calvin did not move until she slept. By the second week of March, the broken step had become the most important board on Calvin Mercer's porch. It was not the top step, where his boots rested when he sat to lace them, or the middle board where Miriam once set baskets of apples in autumn. It was the lowest step, split from an old frieze and mended badly with 2 crooked screws. Calvin had promised for years that he would replace it before someone caught a heel and went sprawling. Now he found himself refusing to touch it. The bobcat had chosen that step. She did not use it with ownership or sleepy trust. She approached in half circles and pauses, nose lifted, torn ear angled toward the trees. But each evening, after the food was gone and the porch had settled into blue hour, she returned to that cracked board and folded herself beside it, close to the cabin wall. Not on the porch, not inside the circle of human life. Beside it. Calvin understood the difference. The weather had softened enough for snow to loosen around the cabin posts. During the day, meltwater ticked from the eaves into an old tin bucket. At night, it refroze, glazing the steps with a shine that caught the porch light. The air smelled of wet bark, smoke, and thawing earth, and from the creek came the rough calls of blackbirds returning too early. One afternoon, Calvin found the bobcat sleeping there in daylight. He had come around from the shed carrying a coil of rope and a handful of nails, thinking about a sagging fence rail near the lower pasture. The moment he turned the corner, he stopped so hard the nails clicked together in his palm. She was on the lowest step, not beneath the spruce, not behind the woodpile, on the step. Her body lay long and low, spotted flanks moving in slow rhythm. Her injured paw rested over the edge, no longer swollen as badly, though she still held it with care. Sunlight touched the pale fur around her muzzle and showed how young she was under all that watchfulness. A burr clung near one shoulder. Calvin did not breathe for a moment. Then the porch bucket gave one loud plink. The bobcat's eyes opened. They stared at each other across 10 feet of cold mud and slanting light. Her pupils narrowed. Her whiskers pushed forward. Calvin expected her to spring away. Instead, she lifted her head, looked at the door behind her, then looked back at him, as if measuring whether the cabin had betrayed her. Calvin slowly lowered the rope to the ground. "I can go around," he whispered. It was a ridiculous thing to say to a bobcat. Still, he meant it. He walked backward through the mud, around the chopping block, past the leaning rain barrel, and entered his own cabin through the rear door, like a burglar apologizing to the house. Inside, he stood in the pantry and laughed once without sound. The bobcat had not moved. She had made him use the back entrance. That was the first warm thing. The second came when he tried to hang his coat on the kitchen peg and missed, because he was still grinning at being outmanaged by a torn-eared bobcat. The third came later, when he noticed muddy prints on the porch mat and wiped around them, leaving the marks untouched as if they were company visiting. After that day, Calvin began thinking of her as Juniper. He did not say it aloud at first. A spoken name felt too close to a claim, and Elise had warned him that affection could disguise itself as permission. But the name arrived because of where the bobcat disappeared when she left, always toward the juniper thicket above the creek, where blueberries clung under dusty needles and the snow melted last. She belonged to those hidden places. She carried their color in the shadows of her coat. Juniper. The name stayed for 3 days before it slipped out. It happened at dusk. Calvin had set the dented tin 3 feet from the door and gone back inside. The stove had just caught, and the room filled with cedar smoke. He was pouring coffee into the blue pot's little cup lid when he heard the tin scrape, then stop. He turned to the window. Juniper had not gone to the food. She stood beside the broken step, looking at it with deep concentration. Then she lifted one front paw and pressed lightly on the cracked board. It dipped, creaked, and rose. She drew back, pressed again. Creak, rise. Calvin watched, utterly still. She repeated the test 5 times, offended but fascinated, as if the step were a small animal pretending to be wood. At last, she patted it once harder than necessary and sat down with her back to it, having apparently won. "Juniper," Calvin breathed, "you're going to lose that argument." Her ears flicked toward the sound. She did not flee. The name hung between them, small and new, and Calvin wished at once that he could take it back and keep it forever. Juniper ate after a while. Then, instead of retreating to the spruce, she curled beside the step, with her body facing the forest and her back angled toward the cabin. Not fully turned, never that, but enough that Calvin noticed. Enough that the old ache behind his ribs shifted again. He had spent years believing he had nothing left that could be chosen without obligation. Peter called on Sundays. Elise checked on him when storms came. Neighbors waved from trucks. Those kindnesses mattered, yet they all carried human reasons, histories, guilt, and duty. Juniper had none of those. She did not know he was widowed. She did not care that his me hurt before rain, or that he spoke to Miriam's yellow mug when mornings were cruel. She had come because a cabin wall held warmth, an old man kept distance, and a broken step gave her a place to rest while still belonging to the trees. That should have made it smaller. Instead, it made it holy. Before bed, Calvin stood with his hand near the latch. Through the narrow glass, he could see her shape under the porch light. Her tail tip twitched once in sleep. A moth tapped against the lantern globe above her. Calvin did not open the door. He only whispered, "Good night, Juniper." Her torn ear moved. The wild did not answer, but she stayed beside the broken step until morning. By late March, Calvin no longer woke to the sound of his alarm clock. He woke to listening. Before the first gray line of dawn touched the ridge, before the stove clicked and settled, before the creek birds began their thin morning arguments, he opened his eyes and held still beneath the wool blanket. The cabin was never fully silent. Wind pressed at the north wall. The old refrigerator hummed with the tired patience of machinery that had earned retirement. A branch scraped the roof in slow strokes whenever the mountain air moved down through the pines. But beneath all that, Calvin had begun to hear smaller things. A faint scrape near the bottom step, the soft tap of something nudging the dented tin, a single board sighing under careful weight. Juniper had turned his mornings into a kind of prayer, though he would never have called it that. He did not rise quickly. He did not hurry to the window. He had learned that eagerness could be as loud as fear. Instead, he counted to 30, sometimes 50, then swung his feet onto the cold floor and dressed by habit. Coffee first, fire second, curtain last. That order mattered. If he looked too soon, she might feel the attention. If he waited too long, he might miss the proof that she had been there. On the mornings when she visited, before sunrise, she left the porch marked in a language Calvin found himself studying like scripture. Round paw prints in the damp snowmelt. A short drag where her recovering paw had brushed the mud. 1 or 2 pale hairs caught near the broken step. Sometimes the tin sat exactly where he had placed it. Sometimes it had been shoved toward the railing, as if Juniper had strong opinions about furniture. One morning, he found the tin upside down, with a single pine needle balanced on top of it. Calvin stood over it with his mug in hand and said, "Message received, though I can't say I understand it." That was the first warmth of the day. The second came when he discovered that Juniper had stepped through a dusting of flour he had spilled near the pantry door then walked only far enough inside the mudroom to leave 2 ghostly paw prints on the threshold before retreating. She had not entered the cabin, not truly, but she had inspected the line between worlds and left her signature there. Calvin swept around the prints for 3 days. The third warmth lived in the way she treated the porch broom. Every time the wind knocked it down, Juniper approached it with grave suspicion, tapped the bristles once, then sat back as if waiting for the broom to confess its intentions. She was not softening in the way people like to imagine animals softened. She was learning details. She knew Calvin's slow boot steps from Elise's lighter ones. She knew the sound of the stove lid being lifted. She knew that the back door squealed worse than the front. She knew the gray jay was a thief and did not waste much dignity chasing it unless it came too close to her tin. And Calvin, in turn, learned her. Juniper did not like sudden shadows passing over her. She preferred to approach from the right side of the porch, never the left. She washed her torn ear after every meal, passing her paw over it with careful, repeated strokes. When she was uncertain, the black tip of her tail moved once, then stopped. When she was annoyed, her whiskers pushed forward and her eyes narrowed, until she looked like an old judge hearing foolish testimony. She still vanished for long stretches. Some days, Calvin saw nothing of her but tracks crossing the lower pasture. Some nights, the food remained untouched until morning, stiff with frost and ignored. He told himself those were the best nights. Those were nights when she had hunted well, when the ridge had provided, when she had no need of his careful little offerings. Still, he saved the untouched food and felt oddly dismissed. His routine bent around her without breaking. He began splitting kindling earlier, while the sun still touched the chopping block. He mended the gate latch with a strip of leather so it closed without its old metallic snap. He stopped wearing the red wool cap Miriam had knitted, because Juniper stared at it with open disapproval the first time she saw it. Elise laughed when he told her, "You changed hats for a bobcat?" She had concerns. "She's not your supervisor, Calvin." He looked toward the porch, where Juniper was not visible, but somehow still seemed to be judging them. "You haven't seen her face." Elise brought a trail camera one Friday and fixed it to the pine opposite the cabin, angled toward the steps. Not close enough to bother Juniper, she said, just enough to learn whether the paw had healed properly and whether the bobcat was moving at night. When Calvin checked the first images, he sat at the kitchen table longer than he meant to. There was Juniper at 2:14 a.m., pale in the camera flash, carrying something small from the creek bank. There she was at 3:02, standing on the porch with snow along her back. At 4:19, she lay beside the broken step with her eyes half closed, not asleep exactly, but resting deeply enough that her chin touched the board. The final picture showed Calvin himself at dawn, stepping onto the porch with coffee in one hand and his suspenders twisted, looking down at the empty tin with the solemn confusion of a man being trained. He stared at the image, then laughed until the sound surprised him. It had been a long time since laughter had filled the kitchen without apology. After that, he began leaving his boots angled differently by the door, so he would not trip while watching the porch. He kept a towel near the mudroom for wet paw marks he mostly did not wipe away. He spoke less to the empty yellow mug and more to the closed door, though never loudly. Juniper never came in, even on the coldest mornings, even when sleet glazed the railings and the porch roof groaned under heavy snow. She refused the open doorway. Once, Calvin left it cracked while he carried ashes outside. Warm air spilled across the threshold. Juniper stood just beyond it, nose working, amber eyes reflecting firelight. She could have stepped inside. Instead, she turned, walked to the broken step, circled twice, and settled there with her back to the cabin, and her face toward the trees. Calvin watched her from the kitchen, one hand resting on the latch. At first, It hurt in a way he could not name. Some old human part of him wanted closeness to look like entering, staying, accepting shelter fully. But Juniper had never promised to become less wild so he could feel less lonely. She had only shown him her version of trust. A nap beside the cabin steps. A body resting within reach of warmth, but not captivity. A wild heart saying, "This close, no closer," and meaning it kindly. Calvin lowered his hand from the latch. Outside, dawn opened slowly over Bitterroot Ridge, and Juniper slept through it. April came into Bitterroot Ridge slowly, as if the mountain had to be persuaded. Snow remained in the north shadows, tucked under the firs and along the creek bank, but the open ground around Calvin's cabin turned dark and damp. Water ran in bright threads beside the path to the shed. The porch boards warmed by noon and released the smell of old pine, smoke, and winter loosening its grip. Robins worked the pasture with solemn purpose, tugging at worms as if pulling secrets up. Juniper approved of none of it at first. She sat beside the broken step, with one paw lifted above a puddle, staring at the mud as though spring had personally offended her. A drop from the eaves struck the boards near her tail. She leapt sideways, landed with offended grace, and then looked through the kitchen window at Calvin, as if he had arranged the weather badly. He was washing his breakfast plate. "I'll put in a complaint," he said. Her ears flicked. Then she turned her back to him and sat on the only dry patch of porch, which happened to be where Calvin usually left his boots. When he opened the door later, he found one boot gently but firmly pushed onto its side. That was the first warmth of that morning, and it stayed with him longer than it should have. The second arrived when the gray jay tried to steal a shred of food from the dented tin. Juniper did not chase it. She simply lowered her head, widened her eyes, and held perfectly still. The jay landed on the railing, considered its future, then left with a loud complaint and no supper. Calvin, watching from behind the curtain, whispered, "Wise bird." The third came near noon, when Juniper stretched in the sun for the first time. Until then, Calvin had mostly seen her curled, crouched, watching, or moving like a shadow. But that day, after eating a little and washing her torn ear, she stepped into the warm rectangle of light on the porch boards. She extended her front legs, spread her toes, lowered her chest, and arched her back in one long, luxurious stretch that made her look briefly like any cat in the world, and then, the next heartbeat, like nothing domestic at all. Her claws slid from their sheaths and caught the wood. Calvin heard the tiny scratch through the cracked window. Juniper stood there, amber eyes half closed, the sun laying gold along her spotted shoulders. A faint breeze carried the scent of wet cedar, creek water, and the first green shoots. She turned her face toward that breeze, and for once, she simply looked present. Calvin leaned on the sink and felt something in himself unclench. He had not realized how often he had been waiting for disaster, waiting for the limp to worsen, waiting for her not to return, waiting for Elise to tell him he had done the wrong thing by caring, waiting, perhaps, because grief had taught him that every gentle thing came with an ending already hidden inside it. But sunlight did not ask to be trusted forever. It only fell where it could. That afternoon, Calvin carried his coffee to the porch chair. He placed it farther from the steps than usual, and sat slowly, letting his knees complain softly. Juniper watched from the edge of the railing, tail tip moving once. She did not leave. She did not come closer. She only remained where she was, stretched along the warmed boards, eyes narrowed against the sun. Calvin kept his gaze on the pasture. A meadowlark called from the fence post. Far below, Bitterroot Creek had broken free of ice and ran over stones with a clear, laughing sound. The old cabin ticked as its logs warmed. Calvin drank from Miriam's yellow mug without thinking, then noticed and did not put it away. For months after Miriam died, he had avoided the porch at this hour. It had been her hour. She used to sit with her knitting in her lap, pretending to count stitches, while watching deer cross the lower field. She had called it doing nothing properly. Calvin had never learned how to do nothing without feeling guilty. Juniper seemed born knowing. She napped in fragments, never fully gone. One ear remained loose but alert. Every few minutes, her nose twitched. Once, she opened one eye when a beetle crawled near her paw, studied it gravely, and then let it continue across the board as if granting safe passage. Calvin admired that. He also envied it. A wild creature could rest without explaining herself. She could leave when the shadow moved. She could accept the sun and still belong to the trees. He wondered how much of his own sorrow had come from believing love meant staying in one shape forever. The porch did not solve him. Nothing so simple happened. But spring brought small repairs. He oiled the gate latch until it closed with a soft wooden click. He patched the screen door and left the old torn square near the bottom because Juniper liked looking through it from outside. He swept the porch less thoroughly than Miriam would have approved, partly because mud returned hourly, and partly because Juniper's paw prints made the board seem visited. On Sunday, Peter called from Spokane. Calvin stood by the kitchen phone, cord twisted around one finger, and told his son about the thaw, the creek, the ranger shed's broken lanterns, and after a long pause, the bobcat who napped beside the steps. Peter went quiet. "Dad," he said carefully, "is that safe?" "No," Calvin said. Then he looked through the window at Juniper, who was lying on her side with one back foot lifted in the most undignified possible angle. "But it's respectful." Peter laughed, surprised and soft. "That sounds like something Mom would have said." Calvin did not answer at once. Outside, Juniper rolled back upright so quickly that dignity returned before anyone could accuse her of losing it. She shook one paw, frowned at the porch dust, and began washing as if all witnesses were beneath concern. Calvin smiled into the phone. The house had not become less empty exactly. Miriam was still gone. Peter was still far away. Winter still waited somewhere beyond the ridge, because winter did. But on the porch, sunlight moved over worn boards, and a torn-eared bobcat slept near the broken step by choice. For that hour, Calvin did nothing properly, and it was enough. The first warning came not as a cry, or a wound, or anything Calvin could point to with certainty. It came as restlessness. By the middle of April, the evenings along Bitterroot Creek had grown soft enough for gnats to gather in the porch light. The snow had pulled back into dirty ribbons beneath the firs, and the mountain smelled of thawed moss, wet bark, and new grass. Calvin began leaving the kitchen window cracked after supper. Through it came the creek's bright chatter, and sometimes the low hoot of an owl above the pasture. Juniper heard more than he did. She had been stretched beside the broken step one evening, shin resting on her paws, when her whole body changed. Her ears rose first, then her head, then her shoulders gathered beneath her like a pulled bowstring. Calvin, sitting at the table with a crossword he had no intention of finishing, watched without moving. Juniper stared toward the ridge. Nothing happened that he could see. No branch broke. No deer bolted. After a long moment, Juniper stood and paced the porch boards from rail to step, rail to step. She did not limp now, not unless the night had turned cold. Her paw had healed into a slight carefulness, a pause before she put full weight on it. But this pacing was not pain. It was listening with her whole body. She went to the food tin, sniffed it, and left it untouched. That troubled Calvin more than he liked. "You're insulting the cook," he murmured from inside. Juniper flicked one ear, but did not look at him. That was the first warmth of a strange evening. The old man attempting humor, and the bobcat declining to dignify it. The second came when the porch broom rolled against Juniper's hind foot. She sprang aside, whirled, and gave it a look so severe Calvin nearly apologized on the broom's behalf. The third came later, when a moth circled the lantern and she watched it with the patience of a hunter deciding some prey was too ridiculous to pursue. But beneath those small familiar comforts, something had shifted. Juniper no longer settled as deeply. She arrived later and left earlier. She paused at the edge of the yard and raised her nose to currents Calvin could not read. Once before dawn, the trail camera caught her standing on the lower fence rail, with her body pointed toward the juniper thicket, mouth slightly open as she drew scent across the roof of her mouth. Elise noticed it when she came to check the camera cards. Calvin pretended he had called her only because the shed lantern needed rewiring. Elise pretended to believe him. She stood in the kitchen, rainwater beating on her ranger jacket, and clicked through the black and white images while Calvin poured coffee. "She's moving more," Elise said. "Spring does that." "It does." Elise looked at the next photo. Juniper was halfway off the porch, head turned toward the creek, eyes bright in the flash. Could be territory, could be breeding season, could be she's hearing other bobcats. Calvin set the coffee pot down a little too hard. Elise did not look up, which was kind of her. "She was never meant to stay on your steps forever," she said gently. "I know that." "I know you know." Those were the words that hurt, not the warning itself, but the kindness around it. After Elise left, Calvin went out to mend the lower pasture rail. The rain had stopped, but drops still fell from pine needles in slow, cold taps. He worked badly, bending the nail twice and setting one board crooked. His hands knew the job. His mind kept returning to the porch, to the empty tin, to Juniper standing with her body aimed elsewhere. He had promised himself not to need her. He had been proud of the promise. He told himself that he had offered food only until she healed. He had respected distance. He had left the door closed. He had loved properly, if love was the word, which he tried not to use where Elise could hear it. But there was a difference between not holding and not hoping. Calvin had hoped. He had hoped for the scrape of the tin before dawn, hoped for amber eyes beneath the porch light, hoped for the torn ear visible over the step while he drank coffee from Miriam's yellow mug, hoped quietly that the wild might continue passing close enough to warm the edges of his days. That evening, Juniper came after dark, not at supper, not at dusk. Long after Calvin had washed his plate and turned down the stove, he heard the soft creak of the lowest step. He went to the window and found her there, but she did not lie down. She stood facing the trees. The porch light made a narrow glow along her back. Her torn ear was dark against the yard. Wind moved through the pines, bringing the smell of damp earth and distant rain. Somewhere uphill, another sound came, so faint Calvin almost missed it. A rasping call, short and rough, swallowed by the forest. Juniper answered without sound. Her mouth did not open. Her body did. She leaned toward the ridge as if a thread had tightened there. Calvin's hand rested against the curtain. For a moment, he wanted to step outside, to say her name, to place himself between her and whatever called from the dark. Then he saw her tail tip move once, not in fear, not in annoyance, but in readiness. She was not being taken from him. She was being herself. That truth did not feel generous. It felt like standing in cold water and pretending not to shiver. Juniper remained on the porch for a while longer. She did not touch the food. She tested the broken step with one paw, creak and rise, as if confirming that the old argument was still there. Then she circled once beside it, lowered herself halfway, and rose again before her body fully settled. Calvin whispered, "Rest if you can." She looked toward the window. Not long, not softly, but she looked. Then she turned from the cabin and slipped down the steps into the wet grass. Her spotted coat broke apart in the shadow of the spruce. Her torn ear vanished last. The food tin stayed full, and Calvin remained at the window, listening to spring move through the pines like something arriving and leaving at the same time. The storm arrived with a sound like gravel dragged across the roof. All afternoon, the sky over Bitterroot Ridge had lowered itself branch by branch until the pines seemed to be holding it up. The air turned warm in the uneasy way spring sometimes did before it changed its mind. Snowmelt ran fast along the ditches. Bitterroot Creek rose brown and loud, carrying sticks and the last thin skins of ice. Calvin felt the weather in his left knee before he trusted the radio. By 3 o'clock, the ranger station had warned of heavy rain, high wind, and possible slides along the upper road. Elise called just before supper. "You buttoned down up there?" "As buttoned as I get," Calvin said, moving kindling away from the mudroom door. "Creek's coming up." "I heard it bragging." Elise paused. "Any sign of Juniper today?" Calvin looked toward the porch. The dented tin sat untouched beside the broken step. Rain had begun to stipple its dull metal bottom. "Not yet." "She may hole up somewhere higher tonight," Elise said. "That would be smart." He did. Knowing had never made waiting easier. By dusk, the rain came sideways. It hissed against the windows and turned the yard to shining black mud. The porch roof leaked in 3 places, each drip landing in a different voice. Quick near the railing, steady by the chair, hollow into the bucket. That was the first small warmth of the evening. Calvin listened to the leaks make their uneven song, thinking Miriam would have named them soprano, alto, and that fool by the steps. The second came when the wind blew the porch broom flat against the door, startling him so badly he nearly spilled his coffee. He opened the door an inch, saw the broom lying there like a defeated intruder, and muttered, "She was right about you." The third came when the gray jay, soaked and furious, appeared on the fence rail for exactly 4 seconds before deciding that pride was not worth pneumonia. Still, Juniper did not come. Calvin set the food under the roof where rain could not wash it clean, 3 feet from the door. Then, after thinking of the creek and the wind and that rough call from the ridge, he moved it 1 foot closer to the broken step. He stood there, ashamed of the small, cheating kindness. "Only because it's pouring," he whispered to the empty yard. The pines bent. Water ran from the brim of his cap. He went inside and left the porch light on. For an hour, nothing changed except the storm's voice. Then, a little before 9, the motion light near the woodshed flashed white. Calvin rose before he knew he had moved. Through the kitchen window, rain blurred everything. The porch boards shone. The spruce thrashed. He saw no bobcat. Then lightning opened the yard for 1 hard second, and there she was beneath the lower fence rail, body low, fur slicked close, torn ear flattened by rain. Juniper. She came not from the juniper thicket, but from the creek side, where the ground dropped steep. Mud streaked her legs. A strip of cedar bark clung to one shoulder. She paused in the open, head turned uphill, listening. Calvin put one hand to the glass. "Come on," he breathed. Juniper moved toward the porch, but not in her usual measured half-circle. She stopped, looked back, then darted beneath the spruce as a branch cracked somewhere above the shed. Loose stones rattled down the slope beyond the woodpile. The mountain was shifting. Calvin opened the door without thinking. Wind shoved rain into the kitchen. The stove draft snapped. The porch light swung, throwing shadows across the steps. "Juniper," he called, louder than he had ever spoken her name outside. Under the spruce, 2 amber points turned toward him. For one breath, she stood between the wild and the cabin. The open doorway glowed behind Calvin. Warmth spilled across the threshold, carrying smoke, coffee, and old wood. The broken step waited below her, slick with rain, but familiar. The food tin sat near it, foolish and shining. She could have come closer. She did not. Instead, Juniper lifted her head toward the ridge. Her mouth opened slightly as she drew in the storm scent. Her whiskers trembled. Calvin saw that fear was not the only force moving her. Something out there had her attention. Territory, another bobcat, a hidden path only her body understood. A second crack split the night, sharper and nearer. The old cedar beyond the creek groaned. Juniper bounded from beneath the spruce. For one wild, hopeful second, Calvin thought she was coming to the steps. She crossed the yard in 2 low leaps, reached the porch, and landed beside the broken board. Her paws slid on the wet wood. She caught herself, shoulders bunching, torn ear pressed flat. Calvin froze in the doorway. She looked at him. Rain ran from her muzzle. Her chest moved fast. The black tip of her tail flicked once, the signal he had learned through careful watching. Not annoyance this time, not doubt. Decision. She pressed one paw on the broken step. It creaked beneath her, familiar even in the storm. Then she turned away. She sprang off the porch, crossed the yard, and vanished toward the creek path, just as the porch light blinked and went dark. The world became rain, wind, and blindness. Calvin reached for the flashlight by the door, knocked over an umbrella, and found the light only after touching the cold latch. By the time the beam cut across the yard, it showed only mud, tearing under rain, the empty spruce, the food tin overturned, and tracks already filling with water. He stepped onto the porch and shouted her name once more. The storm took it. Somewhere beyond the cabin, the creek roared louder than he had heard it in years. A limb crashed down in the dark. Calvin stood in unlaced boots, rain soaking through his shirt, and felt the old helplessness return so swiftly it might never have left. He had not asked her to stay. He had promised himself he would not. But when the flashlight found the broken step empty, slick and trembling under the storm, Calvin understood that a wild creature could leave exactly as she was meant to, and still take the breath out of a house. Juniper did not come back that night. By first light, the storm had worn itself down to a cold, stubborn rain. Mist hung over Bitterroot Creek, snagging in the willows and turning the valley the color of wet ash. Mud swallowed the path to the woodshed. On the porch, the dented tin lay upside down beside the broken step, and the food Calvin had left was gone, scattered by rain or carried off by something smaller than grief. Calvin had not slept. He had sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low, boots wet, flashlight beside his hand. Twice he had stood to go out. Twice the wind had struck the windows hard enough to stop him. Elise's voice stayed in his mind. Do not get lost trying to save what knows the dark better than you. Elise arrived in her Ranger truck with mud up the tires and a thermos under one arm. Her braid was damp, her face drawn from listening to the same storm on another hill. She did not ask whether he was all right. Instead, she handed him the thermos and said, "Coffee first, Calvin, heroics second." That was the first warmth of that hard morning. He took the cup because refusing would have made her fuss, and because his hands were shaking more than he wanted her to see. The second warmth came when she glanced at the porch broom, still flattened against the door, and said, "Juniper may have filed a complaint about that thing." Calvin almost smiled. The third came from the gray jay, which appeared on the fence rail looking damp, indignant, and alive. It shook itself until droplets flew, then screamed as if it had survived worse weather. Elise looked at it. There's the mare. Calvin's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Juniper's tracks had blurred badly, but Elise crouched low and studied what remained. Calvin stood behind her with the flashlight useless in his hand. There were places where the round prints still showed, half filled with muddy water. No claw marks, a bobcat's quiet signature. They crossed from the steps to the spruce, then angled toward the creek trail. She was moving fast, Elise said. They followed the tracks past the woodpile, where rain had darkened every log. Juniper had paused there. Elise pointed to a deeper mark where one paw had pressed harder. Calvin pictured her turning, listening, torn ear flat, deciding again. He hated how well he could imagine it. The creek trail had changed overnight. The path, once packed with needles and deer prints, was cut with ribbons of running water. Ferns lay flattened. A young fir had snapped across the way, filling the air with sharp green sap. Calvin ducked beneath it and caught his coat on a broken twig. For one ridiculous second, he thought of Juniper's burn near her shoulder and how stern she had looked wearing it. He freed the coat gently. Elise moved slowly because she respected the ground. She read mud, bent grass, broken moss. Once she lifted a finger for silence, and both of them stood listening while rain ticked from branch to branch. No sound came, except the creek. Bitterroot Creek was no longer the clear, laughing line it had been in April sun. It ran swollen and brown, shouldering stones aside, dragging branches in its current. The banks had crumbled where rain and snowmelt had eaten under roots. Calvin saw a print near the edge. He reached it before Elise could stop him, boots sliding in slick clay. The mark was faint but round, pressed into a shelf of mud above the water. Beside it, another print. Then nothing. Only torn grass. Only the creek. Elise caught his elbow. Careful. He looked across the rushing water, searching for the torn notch of an ear, the flick of a tail, anything. The far bank was tangled with alder and stormfall. A bobcat could have crossed on a log, leapt to a stone, climbed the bank, vanished. That was the cruelty of it. The wild kept its possibilities. Calvin stood in the rain and felt each one hurt. She may be uphill already, Elise said. Tracks wash fast in this. She may have followed the bank. I know. She may have holed up under rock. I know, he said again, too sharply. Elise did not answer. She let the creek speak until his shoulders lowered. He closed his eyes for one breath. Behind them he saw Juniper testing the broken step with one paw. Creak and rise. He saw her glaring at the broom, stretching in sunlight, carrying food away piece by piece. He saw her at the doorway in the storm, wet and bright-eyed, choosing the dark. He had told himself that choice would be enough. Standing at the washed-out bank, he learned that respecting a choice did not keep the heart from reaching after it. They searched until noon. They climbed above the creek, checked under the leaning cedar, crossed to the lower meadow where elk had churned the mud into unreadable ruin. Elise found scat near a game trail, but said it was old. Calvin found a tuft of tawny fur caught on rosebriar, until Elise said it might have been from any day. The rain stopped, then began again finer than before. At the edge of the juniper thicket, Calvin called her name once. Not loudly, just once. The sound disappeared among the wet needles. No amber eyes opened in the shadows. No torn ear lifted. A chickadee hopped upside down on a branch, shook water from its feathers, and went on. By late afternoon, Elise walked him back to the cabin. The porch looked too ordinary. Tin bucket under the eaves, chair by the wall, broken step dark with rain. Calvin stopped at the bottom and could not make himself climb. Elise stood beside him without touching his arm. She knew this place, she said quietly. That matters. Calvin looked toward the creek. His chest felt hollowed and heavy. She came to the step, he said, then she left. Elise's voice softened. That was Juniper being Juniper. He nodded because it was true, and because truth sometimes gave no comfort. That evening, Calvin washed the dented tin and set it beside the door. He did not put food in it. He only placed it 3 feet from the threshold, where habit and hope could sit without pretending. Then he turned on the porch light. Outside, rain silvered the broken step. No bobcat came. For 3 days, Calvin left the porch light on. He told himself it was because the night still held a bite, and the bulb helped him see the steps. He told himself it kept raccoons from nosing around the mudroom. He told himself many things while placing the clean tin 3 feet from the door each evening. Hope, he discovered, could be as practical as grief. It could wash a dish nobody used. It could check the same window every hour and call that checking the weather. It could keep an old man from fixing a broken step. The cabin moved through those days with careful quiet. Rain stopped. Mist lifted. Sun came weakly over Bitterroot Ridge, touching the soaked grass until steam rose in pale ribbons. Bitterroot Creek stayed high and loud, but each morning it dropped a little. Elise stopped by twice. Once she brought canned soup and pretended it had been extra from the station. Another time, she brought a trail camera card that showed only deer, a fox, 2 raccoons, and Calvin on the porch in his bathrobe. "That camera is intrusive," Calvin said. "It's a public service," Elise replied. "The valley deserves to know you own slippers." That was the first warmth in days, and Calvin held on to it. The second came from the Gray Jay, who resumed his post on the fence rail and shouted at the empty tin, as if Juniper's absence had disrupted official business. The third came when Calvin found the porch broom upright after the wind had knocked it down. He eyed it suspiciously and said, "Don't get comfortable. She never trusted you." But by the 4th morning, even humor felt thin. Calvin woke before dawn to a silence so complete that it seemed unnatural. No rain, no wind, no branch scraping the roof. The old refrigerator had stopped humming, and the cabin held its breath around him. He lay still. Then he heard it. Not a scrape, not the tin, a soft, uneven sound near the bottom step. Calvin did not move at once. His heart had leapt too quickly before. Mice could fool a lonely man. Squirrels could make drama out of boards. He counted to 30, then 50, then lost his place and sat up slowly. The floor was cold under his feet. He dressed halfway, suspenders hanging loose, and moved through the kitchen without lighting the lamp. The blue enamel pot sat on the stove, waiting. Miriam's yellow mug was on the shelf. At the window, he lifted the curtain with one finger. Dawn had only begun. The yard lay in blue shadow. Fog curled low over the grass and gathered around the spruce roots. The porch boards were silver with dew. Juniper was beside the broken step. For a moment, Calvin did not understand what he was seeing. She lay with her body pressed close to the cabin wall, exactly where the porch roof made its narrow shelter. Her fur was darker than before, damp and clumped. Mud streaked one flank. The torn notch in her ear showed sharp against the pale morning. She looked thinner. Her head rested near the dented tin, but she had not touched it because it was empty. She had returned to the place that held no cage, no hand, no claim. Only a step that creaked, a wall that kept wind off one side, and an old man who had learned not to rush joy. Calvin's hand slipped from the curtain. He did not open the door. He wanted to. Every part of him wanted to go out, say her name, fill the tin, kneel close enough to count her breaths. Instead, he stood so still his knees began to ache. Juniper's eyes were half closed, but one ear turned toward the window. She knew he was there. Of course she knew. Her tail tip moved once against the board. Not fear, not greeting. Just Juniper, making her smallest possible announcement. Calvin pressed both hands to the sink and bowed his head. The relief that passed through him came quietly, almost painfully, like warmth returning to fingers after a long cold. He had lost enough to know that not every return was promised. He had also lived long enough to know that when one came, a person should receive it without grabbing. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and yesterday's coffee. Outside, a robin called from the pasture fence, thin and uncertain. Juniper shifted. When she tried to rise, her back legs held, but she lowered herself again almost at once. Tired, Calvin thought. Not broken. Tired from whatever path had brought her back through stormfall, creek mud, and mountain dark. He moved slowly to the pantry. There was no ceremony in the food he prepared. Small pieces, not too much, nothing rich enough to sicken her. He thought of Elise's instructions, of distance and patience, of kindness that did not become possession. His hands trembled while he worked, so he set the knife down and waited until they steadied. When he opened the door, Juniper lifted her head. Calvin kept his body turned partly sideways. He did not look directly at her for long. The morning air touched his face, damp and cold, carrying the smell of mud, pine needles, and creek water. "Morning," he whispered. The word shook. He placed the food not beside her, not close enough to force her toward him, but in the old place 3 feet from the door. Then he backed inside and closed the door with a softness that felt like prayer. Juniper watched the tin for a long while. A beetle crossed the porch board near her paw. She noticed it, lifted one toe as if considering justice, then let it pass. Calvin almost laughed and nearly cried instead. At last, she rose. Slowly, she walked to the tin, ate 2 pieces, and left the rest. Then she did something she had never done before. She picked up 1 piece, carried it back to the broken step, and set it down beside her paw, as if saving it for a future she had decided might exist. After eating, she turned in a small circle, pressed her shoulder against the cabin wall, and lowered herself beside the step. Her face remained toward the trees, but her back leaned against the house. Calvin stayed by the window until sunlight reached the porch. He did not say her name again. He did not need to. Juniper slept, and the cabin, which had been holding its breath for 3 days, seemed at last to exhale. Juniper remained beside the broken step through the whole morning, and Calvin learned how hard it was to do nothing. The sun climbed over Bitterroot Ridge slowly. Water tapped from the porch roof into the tin bucket with a hollow sound. The air smelled of thawed mud and cedar smoke. Inside the cabin, Calvin let the coffee boil too long and did not care. Every few minutes, his eyes returned to the window. Juniper slept in pieces. She would drift down until her chin touched the boards, then wake at a raven's call, a twig snap, the settling of the house behind her. Her torn ear moved even when the rest of her did not. Mud dried along her flank in stiff ridges. A strip of bark still clung to the fur near her shoulder, and once, when it tugged as she shifted, she opened one eye with annoyance, as if nature had become impolite. Calvin nearly smiled. That was the first warmth of the day. The second came when the gray jay landed on the railing, saw Juniper back in her old place, and flew to the far fence post with a less brave cry. Calvin watched the bird reconsider its politics and whispered, "Good judgment, Mr. Mayor." The third came in the afternoon when Juniper woke, stretched one front paw, and accidentally touched the porch broom with her toes. She stared at it for a full breath, too tired to punish it, then let her paw fall back down. Even enemies, Calvin thought, were allowed one peaceful day. He called Elise before noon. "She's back," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant. There was a small silence on the line. Then Elise let out her breath. "Injured?" "Thin, worn down, moving slow, no trouble breathing that I can see." "Eating?" "A little." "Good. Keep distance. Small food. Fresh water. Don't crowd her." "I know. I know you know," Elise said, softer. "But I'm saying it for your heart, not your head." Calvin looked through the glass at Juniper's narrow back leaning against the cabin wall. "My heart's hard of hearing." "That explains plenty," Elise said. He almost laughed, and the sound hurt in a good way. Elise came by near evening, but did not come up onto the porch. She stood by the lower fence with binoculars, rain boots sunk in mud, watching Juniper from far enough away that the bobcat only lifted her head once. Elise spoke quietly, as if the trees were part of the conversation. "She looks tired, not trapped," she said. Calvin stood beside her, with his hands in his coat pockets. "Her paw? Favoring it some, but she's using it. Could be bruised. Could be hard travel. Should we do more?" Elise lowered the binoculars. "Not unless she worsens. More can become too much fast." That sentence settled in him like a stone dropped into deep water. More could become too much. It was the sort of thing Calvin had spent his life learning late. With Miriam, he had tried to fix discomfort with extra blankets, extra doctors, extra questions, when sometimes she had only wanted him to sit quietly. With Peter, he had tried to cover worry with advice until his son called less often for a while. Even with grief, Calvin had tried to organize it, sweep around it, stack wood against it, keep it busy. Juniper would not allow that. She accepted only the exact shape of care she could bear. That night, Calvin set water in a low pan near the step, then moved it farther away when Juniper's whiskers pushed forward. He placed a small meal in the old position and closed the door. She ate after dark, not all of it, and then returned to the same place beside the wall. Calvin sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low. He tried not to watch, though he failed often. The blue enamel pot rested on the stove. Miriam's yellow mug sat beside his hand, warm from coffee he had forgotten to drink. Outside, Juniper washed her torn ears slowly. One careful pass, a pause, another pass. Her paw moved over the notch with such familiar precision that Calvin felt an ache open in him. Wild creatures carried their scars without explanation. People kept trying to name theirs. Over the next days, healing arrived without ceremony. Juniper slept longer. She drank from the pan when she thought no one was looking. The mud flaked from her coat in small dusty patches that made the porch look as if the mountain had shed on it. Calvin did not sweep. On the second morning, she rose and tested the broken step with one paw. It creaked, answered, and rose. She sat down beside it with visible satisfaction, as though an old friend had survived. On the third evening, she brought something from the creek bank and left it beneath the spruce. Perhaps because she had eaten, perhaps to keep her own accounts. Calvin saw only the quick shape in her mouth and looked away. He understood the message anyway. She was not living because of him. She was living near him. That mattered. Peter called on Sunday. Calvin told him Juniper had returned, and Peter was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mom would have left the porch light on too." Calvin stood at the window. Juniper lay beside the step, her body a warm, spotted curve against old wood, her face turned toward the darkening trees. "She'd have pretended it was for me," Calvin said. Peter laughed softly. "She always did." After the call, Calvin went outside with no food in his hands. Juniper opened her eyes. He sat in the porch chair, far from the step, and kept his boots still. For several minutes, nothing moved but gnats in the last light. Then Juniper lowered her chin back to the boards. Calvin did not mistake it for surrender. He did not make it larger than it was. But he received it fully, a wild animal choosing rest while an old man breathed nearby. Both of them wounded in ways neither could explain, both healing better when no one reached too quickly. The creek ran softer below the cabin. The porch light came on. And Calvin, who had once thought love meant keeping what returned, began to understand that sometimes love meant letting the door stay closed and being grateful for the breathing just beyond it. The first kit, appeared like a question Calvin almost missed. It was early June, the kind of morning when Bitterroot Ridge smelled of sun-warmed needles, preak mint, and damp earth drying under the grass. The cabin windows stood open for the first time since autumn. Bees worked the clover beside the lower fence. Calvin sat at the kitchen table with a list of things to mend, though he had written only gate latch, bucket handle, and possibly myself. Juniper had been gone for 2 days. Not missing. Calvin had learned the difference. She vanished into the ridge, returned thin with dust or smelling of rain, slept beside the broken step, and left again before the house could feel entitled to her. He no longer set food every night, only rare offerings when Juniper looked worn. Still, he kept fresh water near the porch edge, far enough away to avoid insult. That morning, Juniper came through the tall grass below the spruce with something careful in her walk. Calvin saw her first as a low flicker of tawny movement between lupine stems. Her torn ear showed above the grass. Her body seemed fuller now, stronger, though she had been secretive for weeks in a way that made Elise raise her eyebrows. Juniper stopped at the foot of the porch. Behind her, the grass moved. Calvin's hand tightened around Miriam's yellow mug. A small spotted head rose from the green, ears too large for its face, eyes round and startled by the size of the world. The kit crouched when a bee passed too close, then stared at the bee with such suspicion that Calvin nearly forgot to breathe. A second kit stumbled into view behind the first, darker along the back, one tiny paw lifted high, as if the dew had personally offended it. Calvin did not move. Juniper stood between the kits and the porch, every line of her body alert. This was not the sleepy visitor beside his step. This was a mother with the whole mountain sharpened inside her. Her amber eyes found the kitchen window, and for one long breath, Calvin felt himself measured more seriously than he had ever been measured before. He lowered his gaze. That was the only greeting he dared give. The first warmth came when the bolder kit pounced on a grasshopper and missed so completely that it rolled sideways into a dandelion puff. White seeds burst around its ears, and the kit froze as if the flower had exploded on purpose. The second warmth came when the darker kit tried to copy Juniper's silent walk and stepped on a dry leaf, startling itself backward into its sibling. The third came from Juniper, who looked at both kits with a weary patience Calvin recognized from every parent he had ever known. He stood slowly and backed from the window. His heart was beating hard, but not with fear. He had thought Juniper's return after the storm was the proof that the cabin mattered. Now he understood that trust had gone farther without ever coming closer. She had brought her hidden life within sight of his porch, not for him to touch, not for him to celebrate too loudly, only because the steps, the wall, the water pan, and the slow old man behind the glass had become part of the safe edge of her map. Calvin called Elise, with his voice low. "You need to come when you can," he said. "Is she hurt?" "No." "Then what?" "She brought children," Calvin said. There was a silence. Then Elise very softly said, "Oh, Calvin, I'm not going outside." "Good. I'm standing in my kitchen like a fool." That part's allowed. When Elise arrived, she parked lower on the drive and walked only to the fence. The kits had reached the shade under the spruce. One had discovered the old sled runner and was patting it with both paws. The other was attempting to climb a root and sliding down with more determination than skill. Juniper watched Elise without moving. Elise lowered the binoculars. Her face had softened in a way Calvin had rarely seen. "2," she murmured. "Maybe 6 or 7 weeks. Healthy looking. She's been denning somewhere close enough to keep this place in her circuit." Calvin absorbed the words carefully. Denning, circuit, healthy. Ordinary words if spoken about maps or surveys. Holy words when spoken about the 2 small shadows beneath his spruce. "Should I do anything?" he asked. Elise shook her head. "Mostly keep doing what you've done. Distance. Quiet. No crowding." Calvin frowned. "No trying to make them porch cats? Or yourself," Elise said. They stood in companionable silence. The sun moved across the yard. One kit sneezed after sniffing a fallen juniper berry, then looked surprised by its own face. Calvin had to press his lips together. Juniper rose at once. She crossed to the kit, sniffed its head, and gave one brisk lick between the ears. Then she turned and walked toward the porch. The kits followed in crooked lines. Calvin's breath caught as Juniper climbed onto the lowest step. She paused on the broken board. It creaked under her weight, familiar and small. One kit stopped below it, nose working, then stretched upward to sniff the edge. The board dipped slightly beneath Juniper's paw and rose again. The kit sprang backward. Juniper looked down with magnificent disappointment. The other kit, bolder now, placed both front paws on the step and peered over the top. Calvin saw himself reflected faintly in the kitchen glass, an old man with one hand over his mouth. Juniper did not bring them to the door. She did not ask for food. She did not turn them toward the human house. She simply let them learn the broken step. Then, after several minutes, she led them away, past the spruce, through the tall grass, and toward the juniper thicket above the creek. The kits vanished in pieces. First tails, then ears, then rustling grass. Juniper looked back once. Calvin stood still. Her torn ear flicked. Then she was gone too. For the rest of the day, the porch seemed brighter. The broken step held two tiny muddy paw marks beside Juniper's larger print. Calvin did not wipe them away. When Peter called that evening, Calvin tried to explain and failed 3 times before saying only, "She trusted the house with a glimpse." Peter was quiet, then said, "That sounds like more than a glimpse." Calvin looked at the steps, glowing under the porch light. "Yes," he said, "it does." By midsummer, the cabin had learned to live with being visited instead of owned. The days on Bitterroot Ridge grew long and honey-colored. Heat gathered on the porch boards by noon, and the pines released their resin scent whenever the wind moved through them. Down by the creek, dragonflies stitched blue lines above the water. Grasshoppers clicked in the pasture. The old tin bucket under the eaves stayed dry most days, though Calvin left it there because Juniper sometimes sniffed it as if it contained news. The kits came often enough to become part of his listening, but never often enough to become expected. That was Juniper's rule. Some mornings, Calvin would open the curtain and find nothing but sunlight, dust, and the broken step, worn smooth where paws and weather had passed. Other mornings, 2 small shapes would tumble beneath the spruce, while Juniper sat on the lower rail, watching the yard with the severe patience of a mother who had not slept properly in weeks. Calvin named the kits only in his own mind. The bolder one, with the dandelion disaster still fresh in memory, became Thistle. The darker, careful one who lifted each paw as if the world might be sticky became Moss. He never said the names outside. Names, he had learned, could be little hooks if a person was not careful. But inside the kitchen, when no one heard, he allowed himself the comfort. "Morning, Thistle," he would murmur, while the bolder kit attacked a fallen pine cone with heroic misunderstanding. "And you too, Moss," he would add when the darker one stared suspiciously at its own reflection in the water pan. That was one warmth of those days. Another came when Thistle discovered the porch broom. Juniper had distrusted that broom with dignity. Thistle treated it as prey, enemy, and dance partner all at once, batting the bristles, hopping sideways, then fleeing behind Moss when the handle rolled. Moss, offended by being used as cover, sat down heavily on Thistle's tail. Calvin had to leave the window because his shoulders were shaking. A third warmth arrived from the gray jay, who attempted to resume his old tyranny over the fence rail and was chased off, not by Juniper, but by both kits rushing in opposite directions and confusing everyone, including themselves. The jay retreated to the spruce and shouted down complaints, while Juniper watched with an expression that suggested the whole valley had become poorly organized. Elise began stopping by less as an emergency and more as a guardian of common sense. She posted a quiet notice at Larkspur Crossing, asking hikers not to approach wildlife near private cabins. She told Mrs. Hennessy that no, the Bobcat family was not available for photographs. And yes, Calvin still needed peaches if she had bruised ones. She spoke to a pair of teenagers who had heard rumors and wanted to see the wild kittens, sending them back down the road with a lecture so calm and thorough that they looked relieved when it ended. Calvin appreciated her more than he said. One afternoon, she found him repairing the lower fence rail while Juniper slept in the shade beneath the porch. The kits were hidden somewhere in the tall grass, betrayed only by occasional rustles and one tiny sneeze. "You look better," Elise said. "I'm standing upright. That helps." "I mean it." Calvin hammered a nail slowly. The smell of sun-warmed cedar rose from the board. "I'm not sure better is the word." "What word would you use?" He thought for a while. "Occupied," he said at last. "In a good way." Elise nodded as if that made sense. Grief had once occupied the whole cabin. It had filled the chair by the stove, the empty side of the bed, the silence after supper. Now other things had moved in without replacing it. Paw marks by the water pan, a bent broom straw, the scratch of claws on the broken step. The way Peter called more often, asking for news of the porch committee, as if Juniper had taken over local government. The house still remembered Miriam, but it no longer remembered only absence. Calvin remained careful. He did not feed the kits. He did not try to draw them closer. When Juniper hunted well, he offered nothing. When hard rain came, or she looked worn from nursing and travel, he placed a small meal in the old spot and stepped away. Most days, water was the only gift, and even that sat near the porch edge like a humble suggestion. The kits grew quickly. Their legs lengthened, their spots sharpened. Thistle learned to climb the lower spruce branches, and then learned with great surprise that climbing down required a separate talent. Moss became skilled at disappearing, so still under fern shadow that Calvin once stared straight at the kit for a full minute before realizing he was being watched. Juniper grew leaner but stronger. Her torn ear remained the same clear mark against the green summer world. She still washed it after every meal. She still tested the broken step whenever she returned, pressing down once, waiting for the creak, accepting the answer. Calvin began to think the step had become a kind of bell between them. Not a call, a confirmation. Still here, still old, still safe enough to rest beside. In August, a heat storm rolled over the ridge without rain. Thunder muttered for hours beyond the peaks, and the air turned heavy, smelling of dust and far lightning. Juniper brought the kits to the porch just before dusk. She lay beside the broken step, not asleep, but watchful, while Thistle and Moss sprawled in the cooler shadow beneath the chair. Calvin sat inside with the lamp unlit. He watched them through the screen door and felt the strange peace of not being central to what he loved. Juniper's life was not about him. The kits would grow and range wider. One day they might stop coming. One day the broken step might wait all evening and receive only wind. The thought hurt less than it once would have. Love had taught him a different shape by then. Not the closed fist, not the open door, the open hand resting still, letting what came near decide for itself. Outside, thunder rolled softly. Thistle twitched in sleep. Moss pressed its back against the porch post. Juniper opened her eyes and looked toward the forest, then toward the cabin, and finally lowered her chin beside the step. Calvin did not move. The cabin breathed around them, full of summer dust, old smoke, and quiet company. Years later, people in Larkspur Crossing still talked about the bobcat who refused to leave the wild but kept returning to nap beside Calvin Mercer's cabin steps. They did not tell it loudly, not the ones who understood. They spoke of it the way mountain people spoke of weather that had spared them, or a river that had changed course without taking the bridge. Quietly, with respect, with enough distance left around the truth. By then, the broken step had worn smooth in the middle. Calvin had never replaced it. The two crooked screws still held, though Elise claimed every spring that one of them was giving up out of embarrassment. The porch boards had silvered under sun and snow. The tin bucket under the eaves carried more rust than metal. The broom had lost half its bristles and leaned beside the door, like an old soldier Juniper had once distrusted and never fully forgiven. Calvin was 71 when he last saw all three bobcats together. It was late September, the kind of evening when the air smelled of wood smoke before anyone had lit a stove. Bitterroot Creek ran low and clear over stones. Yellow leaves gathered in the bends, turning slowly in the current. The meadow grass had faded to the color of wheat, and the pines stood dark beyond it, holding the first hint of coming cold. Calvin sat inside with the kitchen window cracked, mending the leather strap on the old gate latch. His hands moved slower than they once had. His hair had thinned to white. His knees had become weather instruments of questionable accuracy. But his habits remained familiar. Coffee in the blue enamel pot, Miriam's yellow mug on the table, porch light checked before dusk, water pan rinsed and placed near the porch edge. He no longer expected Juniper every day. That had been the final lesson. Some years she came often in spring and rarely in summer. Some winters she did not come at all until a blue dusk in February, when Calvin would look up and find her shape beside the step, as if she had only been gone an hour. Thistle and moss grew into shadows of their own, sleek and private, seen sometimes near the upper trail or crossing the creek stones at dawn. They were not his. Even saying Juniper was his would have been wrong. Yet the cabin had belonged, in some small corner, to all of them. That evening, the gray jay landed on the fence rail, older too, or perhaps only another bird wearing the same bold spirit. It screamed once toward the porch, demanding tribute from a government no one had elected. Calvin looked up from the strap. "You're early, Mr. Mayor." That was the first warmth of the evening. The second came when Elise's truck rolled slowly up the drive and stopped near the lower fence. She had retired from full ranger work the year before, but still wore practical boots and still carried binoculars as if the mountains might misbehave without supervision. She stepped out holding a paper bag. "Mrs. Hennessy's daughter sent peaches," she called softly. "Bruised, naturally." Calvin opened the door. Best kind. The third warmth arrived before either of them reached the porch. From the juniper thicket above the creek, Juniper appeared. She was older. There was no hiding it. Her muzzle had paled until the fur around her mouth looked dusted with frost. The torn notch in her ear remained, familiar as a signature. She moved with the careful grace of a creature who knew exactly which parts of her body complained and which parts still answered. Behind her came two lean shapes. Thistle carried himself with restless confidence, stopping to strike at a blowing leaf as if autumn had challenged him. Moss moved along the shade line, nearly invisible until he turned his head and caught the light. Elise stopped where she stood. Calvin did not speak. Juniper crossed the yard without hurry. She did not look thin. She did not look weak. She looked like herself, older and whole, carved by seasons, carrying every storm inside her silence. At the porch, she paused beside the lowest board. The broken step waited. Juniper lifted one paw and pressed it down. Creak. The sound was smaller than Calvin remembered, but it was there. The board dipped and rose beneath her weight, answering as it always had. Juniper held still for a moment, as if listening to that old wooden reply. Then she lowered herself beside it, shoulder against the cabin wall, face turned toward the trees. Thistle and moss did not climb onto the porch. They lingered near the spruce, grown too wild and too wary for old childhood games. Thistle sniffed the broom from a safe distance, then sneezed as if confirming an inherited suspicion. Moss drank from the water pan and vanished halfway behind the rain barrel, though Calvin could still see the tip of one ear. Elise stood beside Calvin on the path. "She looks good," she said. Calvin nodded. His throat had tightened, but not with grief exactly. It was something quieter, something like gratitude, with weather in it. For years he had thought the title people gave the story was almost wrong. Juniper had not refused to leave the wild. She had never left it. The wild had remained in the angle of her ears, in the silence of her paws, in the way she rested facing the forest, even when her back touched the cabin wall. She had refused only the human misunderstanding of love. She had refused cages, ownership, easy closeness, and the worn doorway that would have made Calvin feel chosen in the simplest way. Instead, she had offered him something harder and truer. Presence without possession. Trust without surrender. A nap beside the cabin steps. Calvin sat slowly in the porch chair, far enough away that Juniper did not move. Elise stayed by the fence, respectful as ever. The porch light clicked on above them, golden in the falling dusk. Somewhere below, Bitterroot Creek murmured over stone. A leaf landed on the broken step near Juniper's paw. She opened one eye, judged the leaf harmless, and closed it again. Calvin smiled. He thought of Miriam then, not with the old tearing ache, but with the softness that sometimes came after years of carrying loss carefully. He thought she would have understood Juniper before he did. She would have sat on that porch, knitting badly on purpose, and said that wild love was still love, even when it slept just out of reach. The evening cooled. Thistle and moss drifted back toward the trees. Juniper remained until the first star appeared above the ridge. Then she rose, stretched slowly, washed once over her torn ear, and stepped down from the porch. At the edge of the yard, she looked back. Calvin lifted one hand, not waving exactly, only letting it rest in the air. Juniper's tail tip moved once. Then she turned into the pines, and the wild received her as quietly as it always had. The cabin stayed warm after that, not because nothing was lost, but because some things had been allowed to pass through without being held too tightly. The broken step remained beneath the porch light, silvered by weather and marked by memory. In winter, snow gathered along its edge. In spring, meltwater tapped into the old bucket below the eaves. In summer, dust settled there until a passing paw, bird, or wind wrote briefly across it. And in autumn, yellow leaves came to rest where Juniper had once pressed her paw and listened for the creak. Calvin still made coffee in the blue enamel pot. He still touched Miriam's yellow mug some mornings before putting it back on the shelf. He still looked toward the spruce line at dusk, not with demand, but with the gentler patience of a man who had finally learned that love did not always come inside. Sometimes there were tracks. Sometimes there were none. Both were allowed. And perhaps that was the piece of the story. A wild bobcat had found a cabin. An old man had found a way to care without holding. And the space between porch and forest had become wide enough for trust to rest there. So now, as the light softens and the creek keeps speaking below the dark pines, the old step waits without loneliness. The porch lamp glows. The broom leans by the door. Somewhere beyond the trees, a torn-eared shadow moves through the night, with all the dignity of the wild still wrapped around her. Thank you for staying with this quiet story. May your own heart rest gently tonight, like a tired creature beside a safe step, close to warmth, still free beneath the stars. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.